All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks everyone who's joining us today for our fireside chat. I First I'm going to introduce Jess. Jess, why don't you give us a little bit of an overview of you and your role, and talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today.
Sure. So thanks very much, Stephen, and thanks to Safeguard Cyber for having me here today. I'm Jess Byrne. I'm a principal analyst on the security and risk team at Forrester Research. I cover a number of things, including CISO leadership and security talent management, incident response and crisis management, and then email security, which is really what we're here to talk about today, amongst other things. So I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Great. And I'm Stephen Spadassini. I'm the CTO here at Safeguard Cyber. So looking forward to our conversation. You and I were able to meet a few times before this and kind of talk about some of the interesting trends that we've seen, specifically around business communication threats. You mentioned it earlier, but I think it's a good place to kind of kick it off of some of the different trends, and we always see like business email compromise attacks and what makes them successful. I think in a interesting way, and I guess maybe to compare and contrast, I'd love to get your thoughts on not only what makes them successful, but also what makes them in some cases the ones that are successful versus the ones that are harder to detect. Is it looking at it just simply from email itself, or are we looking at it from other ways and other channels and communication channels that may affect where email is the ultimate vector where the attack is most successful? So any thoughts that you have around BEC?
Yeah. So I mean, there's so much going on in the sort of communication threat landscape in terms of how things have evolved over the past year. So I think about a few of them. I think about the continued but now more sophisticated onslaught of advanced phishing and BEC attacks, like we're talking about here, right? Because attackers are studying their targets much more. And sure, there are some that are still taking that more simple spray and pray approach, but many of them know that a well-crafted phishing message will allow them to get the desired foothold in their target organization. So, that could be getting credentials for a larger ransomware attack, or that could be social engineering someone into a successful business email compromise. So, I get a lot of questions from our clients about what tools and practices are best for the prevention or at least the reduction of these types of successful attacks. And I think about the email security market and how it's only just now, really, after 10, 15 years of dormancy, innovating to the challenge by developing new deployment options that are there to replace secure email gateways. And they're using AI and machine learning, right, for good to detect anomalies in behavior that could indicate a potential attempt at BEC or at fraud or at credential theft, and just the distribution of malware. So again, it's the attackers are definitely spending more time on their targets. Um, you don't see the Nigerian prince emails anymore. You see much more difficult to decipher whether something's wrong with them. There's just slight changes sometimes to tone or to a character in a URL that you have to look out for now.
Yeah, and a lot to unpack there. I think there was, several things that you said that, I certainly want to, go a little bit on a deeper dive with. I would say maybe in the last 2 years, do you find that the attackers are getting smarter, or are the tools that they're using smarter? So are you see more, like in order to do the right type of attack, you need to understand the right language that they're using in the same context to the conversation. Do you
Mhm.
think that's because they're doing it, and I'm kind of leading the question of saying, is this more the human doing it, or is it more of the AI capability of having more specific pointed type of attacks? Have you seen that change in the last two years?
I think with AI, we've definitely seen much more sophisticated, better written emails, ones that can actually be now, if you're able to study your targets, it could be written in the tone of those particular targets. If you, the scary thing too with AI is we're looking at potential deepfakes later on when it comes to voice. All you need to do is find a CEO, a CFO, a business unit leader on a podcast, and understand how they speak, understand what their voice sounds like, understand what their tone would sound like. If you're in the system, you can really craft those emails. So I would say AI is enabling already pretty smart attackers to get better. They are going to help those who are uh, more basic and just getting into it, just getting started, to get better more quickly as well. But I think it's a combination of both.
Yeah, for sure. The other thing you mentioned was also around social engineering. So do you feel, or do customers ask you that, they say, I think it's pretty typical that they'll say there's other communications that they'll get over different channels, specifically around, it could be over SMS or it could be over, WhatsApp or other channels. Do
Hmm.
you find that when you look at the bigger, larger type of, if we're just focusing on business email compromises, there's really business compromise in general, just communication compromise? Because sometimes what we see is that it might be the reach out. The bad actor is going to try over several different communication
Yeah.
channels. Ultimately, it might come down to email where they want to at least exfiltrate data in some way. But we kind of see that they are more related now with different communication channels. Do you find the same thing?
Yeah, I think so. And I've been saying now for at least a couple of years that we need to put more focus on the other ways that employees communicate, right? Like through Teams, through Slack, through SharePoint, Box, and SaaS applications like Salesforce. And I think these environments are typically considered closed to the outside world. So there's a lot of trust in these systems and the communication that's happening in them. But again, one successful fish of, let's say, a supply chain partner's credentials opens your organization up to data loss, to credential theft, to fraud through VEC, to ransomware attacks. So I've been advocating that protections that are developed for the inbox have got to extend to these environments and throughout the day-to-day workflows of employees, right? And a good example of this, because it, I think people have not seen enough in the news to really start taking this as serious as they should. But a good example of a breach via one of those closed channels is the self-reported Microsoft Midnight Blizzard attacks, where Russian state-sponsored hackers posed as technical support staff. They're doing that a lot. They're using phones, they're using email, they're using Teams, and in this case, they used Teams to pose as technical support staff to compromise dozens of global organizations, including government agencies. And these are highly targeted social engineering campaigns. They put the time in, right? They were carried out by a Russian state-sponsored hacking group tracked by Microsoft as Midnight Blizzard. They're more commonly known as APT29 or Cozy Bear. There's always names for these folks. And these guys were linked to SolarWinds, right? And they're part of Russia's foreign intelligence service. So, we're going to see more happening with other communication channels. So it's definitely time to start thinking about how you apply some of those inbox protections and also awareness and training to those other forms of communication that people think are closed and somehow safer.
Yeah, for sure. I think I was reading in some of the Forrester material that email is still the most used application, but I see year over year it keeps changing. I think there's a roughly about 62% say they use email at least weekly for work purposes. But also understanding, I think, you know, have you a little bit of a loaded question, but I think coming from the pandemic where you were so reliant upon different communication tools that were essentially in office or not at least SaaS aware, did you think this was more of an opportunity for, kind of in the same example you'd given, for an attacker to be able to target employees at organizations, because now the communication channel isn't just email, it's email, it could be over WhatsApp, it's Telegram, it's Signal. I didn't even know, and I learned it from my kids that you can also do it through YouTube TV of sending
Yeah.
messages back and forth. So the platforms will never change. So I guess the question is, as obviously the communication has changed over the last few years. The question is that do you see email staying where it is from a communication channel, or that is slowly going to be less of a communication channel over the next few years?
I think, you mentioned your kids, right? So I think as as younger folks continue to enter the workforce and older folks who probably begrudgingly adopted email back in their mid 90s start to retire, yeah, I think we might see more instant communication. I think there's still going to be a need for email communication. Sometimes more formal communication is now happening, over email. I think there's still a bit of, the sending and receiving of files or links and other information via email. But yeah, I think people are communicating in the mode that they feel is most appropriate and most convenient for them at the time. And sometimes that's a over Teams and Slack, or sometimes that's over something like a WhatsApp or a Signal, depending on who they're speaking with. There's a lot of blurring between what people are using in their personal lives and what they're using for their professional lives. I mean, I know my entire team has a Signal group, right? So, and it's
Sure.
just one of those things that's now incorporated into our lives, and it's mostly for fun, but it's still a way that people are communicating. So, I think emails probably will lose some percentage points in terms of how people are using it, but I don't think it's really going to go away or be replaced by anything else.
Great, thank you. Um, so understanding that probably an overused term of the threat landscape, but at least the communication channels have increased. This puts major burden on corporations to be able to monitor these, not only for security events, but for compliance events. So, what do you see are those major hurdles that, these resource constrained security teams are facing today?
Yeah, so I think one of the the hurdles that are faced is that organizations are really depending a lot on their SOC, their security analysts, to recognize, to classify, to investigate, and to respond to threats. But these security analysts find themselves like often equipped with really inadequate tools. So, considering the criticality of the tasks that they perform, they're working with siloed data, poor integrations, user interfaces that are like stitched together from a tech company that had multiple acquisitions in the past, and then calling all of that a platform, and then they've got these systems that are just hard to use and hard to master. So my colleagues, Ali Mellon and Jeff Pollard, write about analyst experience, or AX, and I think it's actually critical to helping resource constrained teams because something like alert fatigue is real, and it's really difficult for security analysts to properly triage all those alerts without any context. They need to know why an alert deserves more attention than another. And this is again where service providers can help. Like they can take some lower level monitoring off the plates of internal SOC teams and leave the deeper investigations to them. So a better combination of better analyst experience and augmented staffing with managed services, I think is really helpful in sort of tackling those resource constraints.
Yeah, I think it's some of the things that we get from our customers when we're dealing with the SOC is that it's the escalation, right? It's
Hmm.
the level one analysts that have to, that they're doing parts of the investigation. They will raise that investigation up level two, level three to, whether they have better tools or deeper analysis. But do you feel like from an industry perspective, maybe we're potentially missing a little bit on empowering the level one security analysts to take action? For instance, when we look at these communication, channels, if you will, between whether it's again, it's your Slack, it's your Teams, it's your M365, your Gmail and whatnot, and you notice something suspicious, there's certainly a few different actions I think that the level one SOC could take, whether to log someone out of their sessions or issue a new MFA. Have you noticed any trends of, people and organizations saying, if we gave a little bit more power to something that maybe, look, if you knocked an executive off by signing them out of their sessions, they have to sign back in, but at least you're validating whether or not that individual is real. Have you seen any trends in that type of thinking of being able to take action earlier to break an attack chain, or do you still see it's kind of how we've always done it of escalating to level three? It takes, hours to do that and then take action. Have you seen any
Uh,
changes for that?
I haven't seen changes yet. I feel like it's still sort of the latter. And we are actually advocating for merging of L1 through L3 SOC analysts into something um, that we call detection engineers, right? And detection engineering as a practice. And this actually really helps with upskilling, and people can mentor each other. So you can have an analyst take a detection or an alert from start to finish, right? And understand sort of what's happened with that, and take those actions. I think it's great for quickly upskilling your people. Um, but when it comes down to breaking things earlier and cutting off someone like a CEO's access, that's a cultural thing too, right? And you need to know what kind of a security culture you're in, right? If that's going to be something that people will say, okay, hey, whatever it takes in order to make sure that we're secure, that's fine. Or is that person going to have some form of punitive action taken against them? So, this is where CISOs need to really think about building a security culture, not only a culture where people can feel free to do those things if they think it's for the greater good of the company, but if they're an end user that's received a suspicious email or message, to ask questions or to get on the phone and maybe call the assistant of the CEO and say, did this really come from, Bob or Jane, or not? I mean, that's really important as far as being vigilant in organizations.
Yeah, for sure. That's great insight. With the same idea of, or following the same thread as we were talking, obviously level 1 through level 3, and as you're calling like detection engineers, now it kind of goes in from SOC to incident response. And considering again how many different communication channels, do you find it more difficult now for incident response to conduct part of the investigation when they're kind of used to, like, look, this is the end user's laptop, this is their desktop, this is their mobile device, I know I have controls over those. But as we move to more adoption of cloud applications, do you find it increasingly challenging for IR folks to do the investigation and the amount of time that it takes? Because in some cases they may not have access to those conversations, or the data that may be being exfiltrated or leaked through other channels. Give me a little bit of your perspective, what you're seeing on customers asking about how IRs evolved for that.
Yeah, well, so one of the things that's happened with IR is that a lot of those skills have needed to move into cloud, skills in terms of detection, response, investigation, containment, eradication. And so that's been an area where we kind of fell behind, and we've needed to catch up with those skills. So and that all happened during the pandemic, where people, we could see it coming. It's not like we couldn't see the fact that there were going to be cloud focused breaches related to people working in SaaS applications, working from home, working from different environments. But IR folks have had to catch up. So we've actually seen people really leaning on incident response services firms to train and upskill their people investing in things like cybersecurity skills and training platforms to quickly get their folks up to speed so they can actually understand how to collect evidence, and preserve evidence, uh, and keep attorney-client privilege for that matter, when you're conducting an incident response investigation. So um, yeah, I think things have changed, and I think it's really important for security teams, not necessarily the IR folks, but if you have a BISO, even if you're a security leader, to like really understand the changes in how people work, so you can stay on top of this and not get caught flat out, like we did with cloud and the need for better cloud security skills in the SOC. So again, setting up learning groups, setting up little focus groups for people to talk about how they work and where they're experiencing friction with security, what devices they're changing, what communication channels they're using now as opposed to others, so you can keep up with and understand how to protect folks as they work and complete their tasks.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. Um, with that said, do you see, and I guess we touched upon it a little bit earlier around, AI and how the attackers are using that to their advantage, using that for, language-based attacks. But again, thinking from the customer side, is there any new emerging or AI-based tools or mechanisms that enterprises have been taking advantage of, that you've seen or customers have communicated that they've been using to discover more of these communication type of attacks?
in terms of, I think really there's a lot of AI versus AI type situations happening right now. So a lot of folks are investing in solutions that can bring to bear their own machine learning, their own natural language processing, and really use that to create behavioral models of the employees that are in those organizations, and then be able to detect when something's off. You can also build models of communication between employees and your key suppliers, because again, weak links in a supply chain are really where a lot of phishing attacks and BEC attacks are happening that are leading to larger incidents. So you're seeing folks use those AI and ML models built into their enterprise email security solutions. And many folks are taking a layered approach to those solutions. They're using more than one, right? So they're using the native capabilities of, let's say, their email infrastructure providers, Google or Microsoft, and then layering on top another solution to really bring those AI models to bear. So let's say you've caught some of the spam and the spray and pray type stuff, and now you're able to use those models for more sophisticated attacks. So that's what I'm seeing a lot of organizations doing right now.
Okay. I think you started to go down this path a little bit, but so best practices, enterprise comes, talks to you, and they're like, what are the best practices and the recommendations you would go with for organizations to just simply work on how do they enhance their communication security? So it's obviously the awareness and training you mentioned a little bit earlier, but what else can they do to, as far as enhance any of their communication security that they have today?
Yeah, so I think organizations have to think about how to rethink security and awareness training as well. So, because it's really been sort of checkbox and compliance driven, and that's got to get rejected as status quo, right? So, you got to make the goal of your awareness and training program to positively influence, like we were talking about earlier, a security culture, and positively influence employee security behavior. So you got to manage human risk, which means focusing on human behavior over phishing testing. Employee errors remain the most common cause of data breaches. So you've got to find those repeatable practices to help you catch the mistakes and mitigate their damage. Create strong routines, look for simple ad hoc practices, and like reward people for doing the right thing. And really help people understand that secure practices actually mean brand and reputation, right? So you know, eh, don't just tell employees to lock their devices when they leave their desks. Instead, explain that you've got access to our customers' personal data, right? So, um, and the other things I think people need to do are really nail the basics when it comes to the technology and process side of this. And you've got to do things like stop spoofing and account takeovers by implementing DMARC, right? That's something that you can
Mhm.
do that would stop all of the spoofed accounts, and then that leaves just the true account takeovers for you and your more sophisticated email security tools to detect and hopefully thwart. So you've got to practice good identity governance. You should really be moving away from SMS-based multi-factor authentication because there's that SMS fatigue. And those phishing sites are more sophisticated than they were several years ago, thanks to AI. And we talked about this earlier. Attackers are still really looking for the easiest way in. So you've got to be sure that you're looking at your basic identity management and identity governance, and just general email security hygiene as part of your program.
Great, that's a great answer. You got me thinking with some of the points you made. Do you find that now does security awareness training, does that extend past just simply the way of, hey, I sent you an email link and now I'm going to give you the statistics on everyone in the organization who clicked on it, and no, you should never click on an external link, and we've all seen that training. But I think now, because the attacks are more sophisticated, do you find more of the training that focuses, like you were mentioning, where I did send you something over SMS, or I did send something to you over Teams, it did have a web link in it, or it was something that asked for urgency? I think
Mhm.
one of the things that we see all the time is our CEO will send me plenty of texts during the week asking for me to buy multiple Google gift cards because he's urgently walking into a meeting and needs to hand them out. Which, again, I think we all laugh at it, but surprisingly, the statistics of how many people actually fall for something like that without validating whether or not, is this the right phone number? Is this the same phone number? Is this the same name? Is it the same display name? So have you seen that security awareness now extend, beyond just the email part and now to other channels, so they do understand that it is a multi-channel type of an attack?
Yeah, good awareness and training programs do, right? Good awareness and training programs are doing a number of things. When it comes to things like phishing testing, you can actually use a lot of your email security solutions and other providers out there to not just set up standard phishing testing, but to actually grab something that's come to your organization that's real, defang it, and then use it as a phishing test, right? So if somebody tried to send a file that had malware embedded in it, or a QR code that had malware embedded in it, you're able to take that out, detect it, defang it, and still use it as a test and say, this actually did come into our organization. These are the types of emails that we're getting. Like maybe they're targeting specific folks with privileged access or something. And so being able to use something like that from the wild, I think, is far more effective. Even if somebody clicks on it, you're able to say, here are all the things, that were up with this email. It was sophisticated, you know, and then also just doing more training around people feeling the need to ask questions. So if you're getting a three-pronged campaign that was I sent you a voicemail, I sent you a text, and then be on the lookout for my email, pick up the phone, don't call the number from the voice, the voicemail or the text or the email. Call the person that it's actually coming from. Figure out who that is. Find a way to figure out who this came from, or send it to your IT, your security team, and have them take care of it. There has to be a culture where people won't feel like they're going to be mocked or punished for asking questions. And I think that's the biggest part of awareness and training that's got to change if it hasn't already in organizations.
Okay, so that is a great way that organizations at least can, foster a good culture of security awareness, and do it over multiple different channels. I mean, we normally talk like, and here's a great point. I love your perspective on it. So when we talk about phishing with our customers, we talk about phishing not in the email sense. Of course, it's part of it, but it's phishing across multiple different channels. And so I guess the question is, when you mention phishing to a customer, are they pretty much thinking phishing is only applying to email, or are they sophisticated enough going, well, okay, we can get down to smishing, we could get down to watering hole type of attack? Do they understand that it's big phishing now is more prevalent in other channels as opposed to just being an email?
They're starting to see it, right? I've gotten a lot more questions about smishing and vishing in the last year and a half than I ever had before. So because they're starting to see this happening, they're starting to see, people being called that are in maybe like a Sydney office, right, where the headquarters is in North America, and those folks are relying on the fact that the folks in Sydney don't necessarily know what someone sounds like. What did we see in Las Vegas too, right? Those were folks that were using the phone to successfully social engineer people, and it worked really well. Scattered spiders, no joke. So um, there has to be a lot of effort in training, and there also just has to be a lot of acceptance of false positives because you want your people to be vigilant. So yes, I think it's on the rise. People are, again, really, really sort of ignored my pleas to look at Teams and Slack and things like that for a long time. And now when we're seeing the stuff coming out, there's much more interest in, oh, who has those capabilities to protect those environments as well. So it's growing. Every breach, creates more awareness, sadly.
For sure. And the impersonations that can happen over any of those channels are quite simple. There's not as many secure enterprise security controls within those platforms as far as changing a display name or changing someone's image or picture, or dropping in a QR into your exec Slack channel that says, I'm buying lunch for everyone today, pick the menu and we'll have it ordered. And guess what? That was command and control. So I
Hmm.
think a lot of, as you said before, that awareness training is certainly very important in validating where that they're coming from. But let's look at it a different way. If you're advising an organization that may have just been breached or think that they've been breached, what would be like the top three things for an organization that would say, like, what do I do? Give me three things to bolster my defense against communication threats. Like, I have all of these communication channels. You said obviously validate that where these conversations are coming from, but like, from a tool perspective or a solution perspective, what three, what three what three things would you tell them? Like you would tell organizations how to go and bolster their defense.
I mean, honestly, I would say that, you know, bolstering your defense by working maybe with a managed detection and response provider, right? Somebody who can provide some services for this. If you don't have enough folks to triage what's coming in and understand what's happening, make sure you're using some partners to help with something like that, to augment your staff, to augment your skills, um, and having an incident response plan, making sure you're not just calling the 800 number of your IR services provider when this happens. Make sure you have a lawyer, right? All of these things. I heard at um, a recent event that, IR service providers are now the second call that people make when there's been a breach. Your lawyer's the first one, your outside counsel. So making sure that you have all of these things in place before something bad happens really greatly reduces the amount of time to resolve whatever incident is happening. So so yeah,
Yeah,
that was what I would say. And aside from making sure that your own people are much more vigilant.
for sure. And I think and I think maybe this gets a little bit confusing in an organization because they're all structured a little bit differently. When you're talking to folks in an organization, there are, yeah, obviously you have your security teams, you have your SOC team, but then you also have this communication and collaboration team, which in some cases means, well, that's our email team. But these other communication channels, they go, well, that's kind of our IT team. I'm kind of curious to the idea that when we think about communication and collaboration, do you find organizations now are moving that all under one umbrella? Or is it, whether that's coming down from CIO, does that come down from, obviously security is looking at it for risk and everything else, but inside of an organization, how are they structuring communication and kind of putting it under an umbrella, or do you still see it siloed in many different places? I'm curious to that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard that there's sort of like an applications or an enterprise applications type team, and I think a lot of this stuff falls under this. I don't think it's no longer like the unified communications or a communications team. I think it's all falling under, who's managing the applications. And then security, often even when it comes to things like um, email security solutions, they're providing the governance, and they're not actually managing the systems themselves. So I would say a lot of this falls under IT operations, architecture teams, and security again is providing that governance piece, exception management, and things like that.
Yeah, and with on that same vein, then do you think like communication risk, like I think the smaller the organization that comes up more, but communication risk at the board level, do you find that it's really board level? I certainly do when I know there are so many impersonations happening from board members to parts in the organization. So I have to assume that that conversation's happening. But from your experience, like, has it come down to saying, like, we need a solution that's going to solve this because the impersonations of our executive team are getting so prevalent that we can't stop it, or we're getting reach outs over LinkedIn that to employees and go, well, this isn't, you I guess it's more prevalent when you look at Twitter, or as it's known as X now, of like the real name the person. But do you find that again, is it board level at this point that they're really saying that this is a great risk about the impersonations that are happening?
Yeah, I mean, the executive team specifically, has some concerns about impersonation, right? It's mainly the, CEO, CFO, um, even like folks like the CMO when it comes to getting things done. So yeah, there's great concern about it for board members. From what I'm hearing is that people are doing more and more tabletop exercises with the board, right? Because if you're in a massive breach or you've had a massive issue happen, sometimes those are the folks that are going to be the ones that the media contact first. So everybody needs to be involved in understanding, what a response plan looks like and what a communication plan looks like after a breach. So yes, I think there's certainly a need to mitigate these risks. They continue to happen and they continue to get more sophisticated. But I think it's still really at that executive, the C-suite level where we're seeing a lot of the impersonations happening.
Yeah, certainly you can certainly see that pain. We obviously know, when we think about, board level, especially you mentioned the CFO and even just invoice fraud, right? We've certainly have viewed that there's enough of, and it'll be interesting to see if you see these in this, in business communication where the reach in happens over, could be over Slack or LinkedIn and saying, hey, look, I've been trying to get in touch with you to pay this invoice. I haven't heard anything back from you. And then someone responds back and like, I don't have an invoice from you. I don't know what you're referring to. And then email, they get the invoice. Well, let me send it to you right now. Here comes the email. Here comes the invoice that's attached. And then they start adding it up going, well, it has to be real because they reached out to me, said we hadn't paid it. So now that they haven't paid it, I do have an email copy of it. And surprisingly, I shouldn't say surprisingly, we find it that in many cases, the organization winds up paying that invoice without doing all the steps that you mentioned of the
Hmm.
validation of like, do we have a relationship with this vendor? Or have we, have we checked with accounts payable? Have we checked with, CFO? And in many cases, if the dollar denomination is small enough that it doesn't get enough of the visibility, sometimes those just get paid. And of course, it depends on your organization. Do
Hmm.
you find, do you see more of those types of, do customers come to you and say, so this is what happens, and this is, this type of scenario is what happened? Do you find that that scenario is pretty typical, or have you found any variations to that?
It is somewhat typical. People can sort of, there's a lot of outreach that is like, you know, tell me what invoices we owe you, right? And someone just communicates, oh, here are all the things that need to be paid. So typically when this has happened to a company, then they find process, right? A second person has to approve no matter what size. Um, the the invoice rerouting changes, someone else has to have eyes on it, and that's really the important part of the process change. It shouldn't be down to one person because that one person, you know, attackers are relying on the human desire to be helpful and efficient, and so you've got to bring at least another set of eyes into it to check things out and not leave it on that one person because that person's going to feel awful about this too, and it's really not necessarily their fault if it was sophisticated enough and multi-pronged enough and looked legit enough.
Yeah, for sure. We've seen it that in some cases where the dollar amount is the same and the invoice, it comes from a company that is slightly different from a name perspective, a few
Hmm.
characters here of different name, but it looks the same. It's the same dollar amount, and someone goes, well, I thought I paid that, but I must not have paid it, so let me go into that and take care of that. So we certainly see that, but we definitely see it where this multi-channel approach where, I think if you just sent them an email and said, hey, you owe this invoice, probably less effective. But if you get that, you know, minute to react, that the urgency to react by someone reaching out to you over Slack, if you don't have enough communication security controls in place that you allow third parties to connect to you over Slack or over the Teams, you look at it and say, okay, so this must be legitimate, because in some cases, I think the organization or the people who are being targeted go, well, this shouldn't happen because security would have blocked that. There's no way they would be able to communicate with me over these channels, yet you certainly could. So we certainly see, from our point of view, we certainly see that happening quite a bit. So we only have a few more minutes here, Jess. You've been great. It's been not only just a fireside, but it's I've been firing questions at you the whole time. So I
It's been a firing squad.
your
Yeah.
I appreciate all your time. So, any final thoughts or insights that you'd like to share with our audience based upon, some of your research that you've been, doing here recently. I know next week's a big week for Forrester, and you guys are preparing quite a bit. So, as far as as far as what you see, any final thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience here, and and continuing as the ever evolving landscape continues to change.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I try to stress with folks is yes, it's absolutely imperative to fight AI with AI, but I got to get on my soapbox and say you've got to nail some of the basics, because again, you can stop so much of the opportunistic, non-sophisticated attempts from happening and getting into inboxes for employees to engage with in any way, by just doing things like DMARC, making sure that you have really good, content analysis and processing, malware scanning, spam filtering, things like that that are just really important, for email hygiene. And then from there, the second thing is, I'm going to reiterate again, is create a security culture where people feel free to ask questions, push back, and report things.
Sure. Yeah, and certainly, I did give you plenty of loaded questions because, it's certainly where Safeguard Cyber can certainly help out with a lot of these different types of communication challenges that customers have, from not only from security and compliance, but I really appreciate your time today. And I think everyone here got to learn quite a bit about how communications have changed and how risk continues to evolve, and how the attackers are always trying to find the lowest hanging fruit and the easiest path to exfiltrate and get into organizations. So again, I appreciate your time, Jess, and thanks again for doing the fireside chat here with me.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for joining today. And I believe there will be a follow-up with some of the transcripts here. So be on the lookout for that. Thank you very much.